Hello, and welcome to the 90th episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest to the show, Rabbi Daniel Isaac.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Soon to be PhD, and who knows, maybe by the time this publishes, he will have earned his PhD. You did submit your dissertation, right?
Yeah, it won't be that fast unless you're planning 9 months from now at least.
All right, almost PhD. You can't even say ABD because the D has been, the dissertation's been submitted.
This is true.
Yes, and your dissertation was on what?
Moshe Kohen ibn Chikatir's Judeo-Arabic commentary on the Book of Psalms, written in probably Zaragoza in the 11th century.
Awesome. So you're basically a specialist in early medieval Judeo-Arabic rabbi stuff?
Yeah.
Okay,
Islamic Jewry, if that's an oxymoron for you.
There we go. So wonderful. And I'm very excited. And we are shooting this in Cincinnati, Ohio, where both of us have resided for the last few years. You preceded us by a year in Cincinnati? That's right. So we are focusing on something that is it's musically related. We're talking about music, but there's a drinking component to the music, right?
Music and drinking go together.
Right. So to kick things off, we have some delicious beverage in our hands. We've got some mead, so we're doing mead and music, if you will. So to that, l'chaim.
Chaim.
All right, mead and music. So we're focusing on actually not one but two different writings of Rav Hai Gaon's halachic responses.
Yep.
So he is writing in response to questions being posed to him involving music, and there's some drinking involved too.
Music and drinking comes up. Drinking actually comes up within the context of music.
Not the other way around?
Not the other way around,
yes.
But the way that the question is answered by Hai clearly indicates a connection that is more than casual. Before I say what that is,
I was going to say this is I believe
to see what Hai says.
Say this is probably our first musical episode.
If you say so.
Yes, we've had dozens and dozens of episodes, and this is not only our first involving you, but first involving music. So.
Well, there's plenty more where music and
there's a lot of Jew. Yes, I was going to say. There's a lot of music in Jewish life, and certainly when it comes that intersection with alcohol.
This touches the subject off, but there's plenty Talmudic material. There's plenty other responsa on the subject that essentially go back to these two shortim, which are really the earliest investigation of the question of music and halakha as a sort of solid study in and of itself, if you can call a too short shortim a study. But it's the start of a question, but it was always there. It's always been there in society.
And speaking of temporal situation, Rav Hai was, I think a lot of people think of him as not the last of the Mohicans, but the last of the Gaonim.
Yep,
right?
That's right.
Whether he actually was or wasn't.
I doubt he had a Mohican on his head, but probably was wearing a turban of 12 feet long.
I'm just making the Hollywood reference. But last of the Gaonim.
No, for sure.
So last of the Gaonim, although you were telling me he may not actually really be the last.
No, he's not really the last. There were Gaonim who lived for several centuries afterwards, and some of them have left us poetry, polemics, legal disagreements, but
he's 10th-ish century.
He dies in 1038.
So born in the 10th, or dies in the early 11th century.
I can't remember his exact age. His father was 100 when he died, and I think Hai was at least 90 something.
And they're in Babylonia.
Yep, they live in the capital of modern-day Iraq, Baghdad, and Jews continue to live there, obviously, until 1258 when the Mongols arrived and sacked the city. It's not clear what happened to the Jewish population, or in fact what happened to Jews in that area for at least 2.5 centuries. But suddenly the names changed from Aramaic names to Arabic names, and we get a different culture developing there, and it really only starts to produce literary productions from the 17th century onwards, and really in the 18th and 19th, 20th century. But that's completely unrelated.
Many centuries later.
I can tie it in at the very end, how 20th century Iraq is somewhat related to
that'll be a bonus,
century Iraq,
a Babylonian bonus, if you will.
Yep, to do my masters. But let's save that for the end. So the two responsa.
Yes.
I can, I guess, expound on them. So the two responsa were published in originally in a collection of Teshavot Gaonim, but then have received treatment by Don Harand in an article on high-end music.
Which I note for the listeners, I was going to reach out to Professor Harand, but he is no longer in the land of the living.
Alas.
Right.
I don't know him. I stumbled across this in my own research.
Right. So we're going to do even better because Daniel has some thoughts on this research
I do.
by Professor Harand of blessed memory.
So I'm going to try and lay out what he has to say as best as possible and then make some observations. His area of expertise was music, not halakha, and he did receive some assistance from Professor Yalom in working on the Aramaic of the second short, but that's that.
Okay, so what were the questions
normal.
posed to Rav Hai?
So Hai Gaon refers to a number of issues in his shorts, implying that they must have been in the question. We never know what the questions are because when it comes to shortim, we always get the answers, and the question is the question as presented to us is how the answerer understands the question. We don't necessarily know the original.
I feel it's like Jeopardy. We have to ask the question that prompted the answer.
Right. Well, so we don't actually know.
Okay.
See, questions would have flown back possibly in all sorts of scraps of paper from a merchant and who was carrying it. These are all questions that way beyond the scope of this, but we never really know the question actually. We normally just know the answer.
It really is Jeopardy. We only know the answer.
Yeah,
we have
and
to
if I
guess
knew what Jeopardy was, which being not American, I'm not
for the American listeners, you know.
I don't know what it is. I don't have much love of game shows, but so we don't really know. Yeah, you have to kind of guess the question. But, I mean, the way it's written, it implies that Hai gives us a truncated version of the question.
Okay.
And he wants to ask what songs are allowed to be sung. All these questions come up in the short. Are they only Hebrew songs? What can be in the songs? What content?
The content of the songs.
Content of the songs becomes a question. I mean, the language even matters, like what language you sing in. It really does matter to rabbis. If you think about their world of rarefied literary production where writing piyutim was really important. Hai, I don't think, wrote piyutim, but certainly his predecessors did, and those who came after. There's a long tradition of writing piyutim for 4 centuries at this point, if not longer. So the presence of non-Jews at weddings, which was a common theme, you'd have musicians, and they might sing. Women singing. Women playing music. Women and men singing together. Women singing only with women, what instruments may be used, and here it becomes a little tricky, and we'll come to that in a minute. So the response that Hai gives is a bit contradictory according to Haran. I think there's a way of understanding what's going on here with Hai that makes it a bit less contradictory, but you can decide for yourself. So first and foremost, the rabbi, there's nothing going that says rabbis allow you to listen to music for pleasure. They seem to all ban it and repudiate
Who's the they?
it. Rabbinic Talmudic rabbis seem to ban the listening to music purely for pleasure.
In the Bavli.
Yeah, and yet they some side which seems to allow it for religious purposes. And it's a tension that runs through early material. And of course it plays out in Hai.
Sounds like drinking might be involved.
Yes, and that
clearly
is
a topic for future investigation.
So this is where it starts. Like, where does drinking get involved? So, as you know, people go to parties, they play music to entertain people, and they get drunk. And this is going to be a real issue. So, if you imagine Hai's knowledge of music, and we don't know anything about his life, like how he lived, really. If he knows obviously about drinking parties. He knows what the Arabs get up to. He knows of, there's the famous Harun al-Rashid, perhaps the most famous of all the Abbasid caliphs.
Okay.
Khalifa in Arabic, who's famous for his love poetry, his drinking, and partying, big time. The whole Arab world drinks.
Well, here's the funny thing to me, setting aside the Arab Muslim stuff about drinking. What's amusing to me is that if this were a music show, we would say, drinking, why is there why should there be a problem with music and drinking and shutting off the music? Shouldn't we shut off the drinking? Why the music? You know, like
right, exactly.
But this is the home field for drinking. So okay, music can go its own way.
Music's there, but you see, you got. If you imagine this: you're sitting in the Alhambra palace in southern Spain, or as it's said today, the Alhambra, which means the red fort, red castle, essentially in Arabic, Hamra. You're in the courtyard outside on a warm evening in southern Spain, and you've got a garden with water running and nice plants and some shade and so forth, and you've got some young, and this is the reality of the time, young boys and girls pouring you wine, and you're reciting poetry about the three main topics of obsession, which is love, is wine, women, and death, and the desert of southern Arabia and the old Bedouins. You're going to get drunk. Not every line is going to be so edifying. In fact, most of them are not. And they're going to be very materialistic. So that is the image in Hai's head of a drinking party in the Islamic world. Now, it's not unique to the Islamic world. The Arab Romans had their own versions of these things. Plenty of gossip that's been handed to us about the excesses and extravagancies of Roman emperors, true or not, that could put the best of the party goers to shame. So that's all in Hai's head. Okay. He's a rabbi. He's very serious, and yet there's a tradition in the Talmud of drinking and partying and singing at weddings and other occasions. So how can he ban that? And that's what he's got to basically contend with in these shutim. So the first shutim, we don't know which one's older. There's no chronology here. The first one is addressed by Rabbi Nehemiah ben Ovadia from the town of Qabis, or in what's southern Tunisia today, a coastal town which had a Jewish community until obviously the 20th century. It all emigrated.
Southern Tunisia on the coast?
Pardon?
Southern Tunisia?
Southern Tunisia on the coast.
What does south mean, north?
Supposed to the second shut, which will be from the north.
Okay.
Of the northern part of Tunisia.
Okay. I hope you've been enjoying this episode featuring Rabbi Daniel Isaac. I want to give you a sneak peek right now into next week's episode featuring Rabbi Ezra Goldschmidt on, it's Rabbi David Halevi Siegel on Chadash. It's an interesting topic and how beer interfaces with that. So here's a sneak peek.
A lot of people read this and they assume, like, what kind of hedonist is this guy? He's got to drink beer. And they assume that the Taz relates to beer in the same way that you and I relate to beer.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, it's so many things. Can I interject? So I'm just going to interject. This is not the only time the Taz writes about beer. Okay. It's just not. Now, hedonist, I don't know if I would say hedonist.
I can give you a better explanation that doesn't really entail.
Okay, sure. I'm curious to hear what you have to say. I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Rabbi Ezra Goldschmidt, and now back into this week's episode featuring Rabbi Daniel Isaac.
So the community of Qabis is a trading town, and the community wants to know if Jews are forbidden to play music, and obviously when. And that's really important to the first source, because Hai's answer really answers when can you play music and under what circumstance. And the first source he offers is Mar Ukva's statement in the Talmud, and maybe it's worth hearing the text. Hearing the text in full, which is Tahad Shalahule la Mar Ukva Zamara Minalan da Asir Saris V'chatab lahu Al Tismach Israel El Gil Kamim Lishloach Laho Mehacha Bashir Lo Ishtul Yain Hane Mili Zamara Demana Aval Defuma Share Kamash Malam. So now, with reference, this is a translation in Haran. Now, with reference to the tradition that they sent to Mar Ukva the question, from where in Scripture do we learn that music is prohibited for us? Afterwards, he ruled and wrote to them the verse, "Do not rejoice, Israel, as do the nations for joy," which is a pasuk in Hosea. And continues, why did he not reply to them from here, i.e. this verse, which he quotes, "They will not drink wine in song," in Yeshayahu. And I'll repeat in the Hebrew, lo yishtu yain. And this is the important bit where it connects to the podcast. Drinking. Yep. Is because these words could not be understood to refer to the prohibition of instrumental music only, while vocal music we might consider is permitted. And that's Hai's take on Mar Ukva. It's really important. So here you've got Yeshayahu, which seems to link not partying it up and drinking wine and listening to music versus just not listening to music.
I mean,
wine.
the curious thing I want to know, what is the scriptural, the Isaiah, what's the context?
The context has nothing to do with this. The context is really basically...
Well, it's how Mar Ukva understands.
Right, the context is basically hold back and don't be excessive. And that, I think, is the only bit that Hai's really interested in. Like, Ishaya is basically chastising them for excess.
So the pairing of drinking wine and music is problematic here from Isaiah, as understood by Mar Ukva, and now through the lens of Rav Hai.
Right, because Rav Hai's purpose for Mar Ukva is rather, at least in the first short, is to try and take him down from an apparent blanket prohibition of music to something like you can sing certain type of music.
So it's qualified.
And one of those qualifications seems to be don't sing with wine. We'll talk about that in a bit later. Again, once we've understood where Hai takes us. Hai then kind of basically asks all the questions I set out at the beginning: when, where, how, what, and why. Vocalic, non-vocalic, weddings, non-weddings, and who may sing. What kind of songs may be sung?
I have to say this. I know this is a tangent, but...
Go ahead.
So, later on, a few centuries later in German... Well, you know what? Never mind. In the Talmud, it says, Ein shir ela b'yayin.
Yeah.
Ela al yayin. That we don't sing, or there's no song except over wine. And that's later on
used
to justify why wine is used at Brit Milah ceremonies.
But see, that's sanctioned. It's serious.
So that's the difference. But there's a connection of shira and yayin in the Talmud, where we have song and wine paired, and that's licit, right?
That's licit, but it's a constant tension because some rabbis, they don't really care about this whole problem of wine, singing, and singing in general, music, even instruments that Hai is going to prohibit. And then there's the more restrictive guys who, like a plain reading of Mar Ukva, says no music, or the famous Mishnayot, which completely banned music after the destruction of the temple. Which
depending how you read it, that's in Sota.
In Sota. Depending how you read it, that's always the question here. How you read it. And Hai reads it.
Are we going to that right now?
Yeah. Well, we're not dealing with that Mishnah, and he quotes it, but it's not essential to the argument. Really, the whole argument stems on Mar Ukva rather than.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right, it's interesting. It's on Mar Ukva that things rest.
Well, I'll say this for the listeners out there. Amongst the 5 times in the entirety of the Mishnah that Beit Mishteh is mentioned, one of these 5 is talking about Beit Mishtaot. That after the destruction of the temple, this is found in Mishnah Sota. After the destruction of the temple, that in Beit Mishtaot, in drinking houses, that song ceased, and it quotes from the book of Isaiah also, and for those interested in a little bit more about Beit Mishteh and the Mishnah, you can check out episode 55 of the Jewish Drinking Show for that conversation.
Which I might do too then. Hai takes Mar Ukva to say you can't sing the melodies that are licentious, which of course immediately takes
the melodies and not the words.
The melodies.
That imply the words.
That imply the words. So in fact, the words forget the words, if you like. Don't sing what he calls ash'ar al-ghazal.
I was going to say it's like
the
a
love
Geder.
Poetries of the Arabs, all the more so, which I referred to at the beginning, and all the more so their melodies.
It's so interesting because love songs persist throughout.
Of course they do, right? And
forever.
And we get to the very end.
Even till now.
Even till now, and we get to the very end, and the famous.
And we go back to the Bible, Shir Shirim, like it's forever.
Kikolech arev or marech naweh is a famous line, and about your voice was like desirable and your appearance comely, and we're going to use that to say completely the opposite. Or Hai is, but Hai is basically saying the old line that the scholarly class will always say. Like, you shouldn't be... The rabbinic scholarly class will always say you must be chaste in your behavior, you must be circumscribed, you must be... you shouldn't be bawdy. Okay. And yet, that bawdy tradition has always existed alongside it. But he knows this. The question is, how much is he willing to tolerate?
Yeah.
And that's where he goes in the next move. Having basically said Mar Ukva says nothing, he then says Mar Ukva only allows edifying music. Holy religious music with the right words and the right melodies. What those melodies could have possibly been, since Jews don't have an independent musical tradition, all of our musical tradition is in some ways borrowed from the surrounding society. The only possible tradition that some musicologists consider might reflect temple music is Gregorian chants. That's about, as far as to my knowledge, but somebody maybe more expert can say. So we're sort of left with the puzzle and what practically high even means there. But okay, this is not a point that Haram brings up, but he sort of leaves it as unsaid. But what does high actually really mean? Like, what songs are actually really allowed in terms of melodies? It's not really said. And even you look in modern Jewish practice, you can't use a secular melody in the synagogue, becomes highly contentious because what is a secular melody? To illustrate this, an anecdote: the famous Hazan Simcha Kozovitsky was once when he was employed at the Great Synagogue in London, famously sang Kaddish to Kesar Asara, to which people were shocked and askance. And when asked about how he could do this, he responded, "No, it's a famous Ukrainian folk song." He was completely oblivious to its origins. So yeah, the idea of music and inappropriateness is a consistent theme, and of course add drinking in and it's super inappropriate, potentially at least. Which of course is why alcohol is sometimes sanctified and sanctioned, as you can do it, you drink it in these circumstances and none other, or ideally none other. So which takes us, at this point, High Shut takes us to the leniencies that have developed in Halakha on the listening of music. The music, as I mentioned, those rabbis who simply ignore the stringent opinion. And I think this is the interesting thing. When you say Halakha Kabatra,
that the Jewish practice follows the later
opinion. What does that actually practically mean? As far as I understand the term, it means that I've already examined the concerns of the earlier opinions, and I found them not to be as concerning to me in whatever the context you're living, and I think you can do this. And this seems to, and if people accept this, then it becomes halakha. If people argue, no, you've not understood the original discussion, then it doesn't become the halakha, or it might become the halakha for some groups. And of course, that's, I think, partly why you see different social groups are more or less lenient on this topic of music, and of course, and its connected to, and its connection to drinking, in which again you see the same kind of split in social behaviours.
Hey there, I wanted to see how you're enjoying the episode so far. If you have any feedback, comments, questions, anything, please let me know. And also, if you have topics as well as potential guests, including, who knows, maybe yourself, please let me know. Feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you, and now back into the show.
When you're drunk, irrespective of what kind of music's going on, you might behave badly. And once you add music in, and this is the really interesting thing, is that people understood that music changes the way people behave. They start gyrating, and that comes up in the end of.
It sounds like Elvis and the Beatles.
Right. So yeah, go look at dancing to drums, and you'll see that there's a lot of physical body swaying across the Middle East and other parts of the world that bothers people who don't like that, and that's so high when discussing the role of women. He bans antiphonal singing, men singing and women answering, or women singing and men answering.
That is part of the
that shoot. Appears in the short. He bans it. He says you shouldn't do this, which there's plenty of biblical and Talmudic evidence to say to the contrary. He also bans even women.
So what all
singing alone?
What all? So
drums.
You know what? Let me ask you this: what all does he permit, and what all does he prohibit, and how much gray area is there in between?
So at the end of the day, he basically allows edifying music. It seems he allows edifying music, but never clarifies the bit in between, like what that bit that Rav.
So edifying, he's good with for vocals.
Bawdy music is.
What about with instrumental?
With instruments, it's not clear. Like and maybe edifying music with instruments is okay.
And is this also in the context of a Beit Mishteh or with drinking?
Yeah, because he says it's weddings and circumcision.
So usually the context of these are religious ceremonies, weddings, circumcisions, other celebratory occasions.
But he doesn't want non-Jews singing at that wedding.
So is a lot of part of that about the content?
Songs.
Is the content?
Content is an issue.
So content matters for him.
This is the.
So Gentile songs or Gentile singing is problematic for him.
Mm-hmm. This is why it's unclear. Like these are the grey areas, and
what
they stay to this day. Until
wait. Where's the gender stuff?
Well, the gender stuff comes at the very end of the short, in which he basically admits women have private henna parties before the weddings, and which they dance to drums and clearly must be gyrating.
But that's okay because it's just women.
Well, he doesn't like that either. But other authorities, he says, just permit it, which suggests to me that you should the rabbinic overseeing of these things is a myth, and that they only have stop it anyway.
It only carried so far.
It only carries so far the capacity to set the standards. In fact, the truth of the matter is, it doesn't sound like it. From the nature of the question, it doesn't even sound like that, and that touches a little bit on the second short, which before we
wait.
go
so going back. Wait. So going back. So ultimately, what is? He permits Jewish singing or Jewish songs, Jewish content by Jewish singers, not Gentile singing, because presumably there's going to be Gentile content, and not even Jew singing Gentile content, presumably, or maybe even secular content. We could say it doesn't even have to be. And he's also leery about romantic or other love-related content, and that's also with instruments.
That's not clear.
That's not clear. It's more
maybe
about
without
the content
alcohol. Maybe without alcohol you can do musical instruments, but with alcohol, no.
So this is presumed really within and out. So these are at these various occasions. Presumably, alcohol is involved.
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
That seems to be where the bottom line is. I mean, there's a final point that he cites, Rav Shmuel ben Nachman, in the name of Rabbi Yohanan, that. Whoever drinks to the 4 kinds of instrumental songs brings 5 calamities on the world, and he cites the verses. And he mentions 4 instruments, the kinnor, the nev, the tof, and the halil. And I want to stress that what these instruments meant in the biblical period and what they might have meant to Hai, we don't know. Like what modern instrument they meant to him, we don't know.
Clearly, we need a Talmudic music episode for sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's more to be said on this, and I'm by far not the expert in it.
But for our person, it's another. That's
definitely
really cool.
Looking at music, Talmud, and alcohol would be a great podcast.
It's a great to discuss. Trifecta, yeah.
Trifecta, absolutely.
Intersection of 3, yes.
I think Hai's trying to ban it as much as possible, but the limits of his power to influence the society is clearly there, because he can't really stop it. But that's true of all laws, and the rabbinic class may want to do something, but if it doesn't, if it's not accepted by the community, then it just won't happen. And I'll save some observations about post-Hai thought on the subject as an observation, just by adding the second short. The second short is addressed to the community of Qayarwan, by the community of Qayarwan to Hai, and in response, Qayarwan in northern Tunisia.
Oh, not Kairouan, suburb of Cairo.
No, Qayarwan.
Oh, cool.
Al-Qayarwan in which is near the modern town of the ancient town of Carthage, or Cartaginta, to give it its Aramaic name. So it's substantially different from the first short, and it doesn't discuss any of these nuances about with instruments, without instruments, women, men, alcohol, no alcohol, what type of music. None of these questions come up.
And this is a shorter one also.
It's a shorter short in Aramaic.
Are they both in Aramaic?
No, the first one's primarily
in Hebrew. The second one's Aramaic. Okay.
So it's again, he cites Mar Ukva and the discussion there, and he more or less, but there he reads it as a blanket ban. And doesn't,
irrespective of the
content, irrespective of the alcohol present or not. It seems to be read as a blanket ban. Yeah.
Wow.
It's fascinating. Maybe that suggests this is his first thoughts on it, and the other one is a more nuanced argument.
Yeah, maybe he got pushback after.
It could be, but that's speculation. Yeah, we don't know dates.
That's what we're here for.
And then he cites Mar ben Rav Ashi's. Oh, Asi, it's not clear to me. I think it's Ashi here, but his opinion that someone who listens to music will have his ear lopped off.
As one does.
Or menagah ketorah, it's like goring like an ox. In other words, which itself is an interesting literary reference that Hai picks up on at the end, but we won't discuss this. But it basically comes out as against the lenient position of Rav Hizda, which he only addresses parenthetically, without the kind of nuanced discussion about this in-between music that I suggest exists there. The focus of the question is and I think this might suggest who asked the question, is about the focus of the short's answer is about people who have to sing in front of the king or perhaps in front of important and powerful people. And he uses the example from Nehemiah, chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, in which Artaxerxes asks him, why are you so glum, why are you so sad? And he says, I'm sad because the temple's destroyed, and how can I sing and be and rejoice? Which of course is the strict opinion. And of course Nehemiah is offering him his drink at this point, just to make aside, though it's not
it's
essential.
An aside, but
it's an aside, but it's relevant.
Directly relevant.
In other words, Nehemiah is his servant, and he's got to do what his master says. If you think about Lord of the Rings, just as an aside, I quite like it. There's a scene in Lord of the Rings that's adapted in the film in which Pippin is singing. In the final film, in which Pippin is singing for the steward of Gondor. Yes, the Return of the King. And in the steward of Gondor is grumpy and eating his food, and they give you a lovely close-up of him biting into the food, almost revoltingly. So whilst Pippin sings a rather sad song. And that, I think, is Tolkien's reference to Nehemiah. A fascinating observation.
Wow. And it's a nice biblical illustration.
Yes, the psychology of the steward is completely different to Pippin's, and what mirrors the psychological difference between Artaxerxes and Nehemiah in the
Sefer Nehemiah, in the book
chapter
of
2 of
Nehemiah.
Nehemiah. Of course, that beautifully matches Psalm al-Naharot Bavel, where it says, how can we sing the songs of Zion on a foreign soil or a Gentile soil? Once again, the idea the rabbis say of the banning of music. And of course, obviously they sang music. As we know, plenty of biblical texts talk about singing music with wine, singing men and women together. All the stuff that's addressed in the first short. It's all there in the biblical narrative. And yet, the impression that Hai gives us is the only circumstances in which one's allowed to sing with music, and presumably with instruments, is if you're forced to, because you have to appear at the court of the king. Or
so
maybe
not even a wedding or other celebratory occasion.
And I can't imagine that Hai wasn't aware of the custom of people to sing music and stuff and use music at weddings when he wrote that second short. In other words, I don't think that these shortim are meant to stand in contradiction to each other. They clearly sit together. And I think this might suggest what he's really talking about in the second short, which is that whoever's asking this question is someone who works and lives in a society. He's a merchant, perhaps, or of some importance, and he's got to attend to the local court or some local bigwig, and part of that involves him sitting there at drinking parties and music and participating, quite possibly.
So he wants to limit his interaction with others.
So he's possibly saying, and if it's under duress, then you can do this. So I think these two teams are not really standing in disagreement with each other, just talking about different stories, different contexts. And because we don't know the stories properly, we can only guess, and everything I'm saying is entirely speculative. That's why Hai is not saying the same thing, and I think that's why it ties back to what I said to you. We don't really know the question of circumstances, because Hai doesn't tell us that. He only leaves us the legal bits, and obviously the questioner knew his own circumstances, so he didn't need that sent back to him in the short. Even if it's quite possible that Hai had a version of this deposited somewhere. But it's quite possible. Very often, shortim weren't just sent to the. They weren't. The short wasn't just sent back to the person without some record of it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have these shortim. But even then, it's sometimes those records might actually preserve a bit of the question in full. But not in this case, unfortunately.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I want to break in again, and if you have ideas beyond the show, beyond the podcast, beyond this video content, if you have ideas for what Jewish drinking can bring you, whether it's, who knows, maybe it's Zoom sessions, maybe it's events, maybe, who knows, swag, please let me know. I'm very curious to hear from you any ideas, things that we can do, things that I can bring you from Jewish drinking. So feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. I'm happy to bring that to you. All right, now back into the show.
I want to add 2 points here.
Sure thing.
One is the drinking parties I mentioned at the beginning obviously could be the context of the second short.
Okay.
And the first short obviously intimates that drinking parties were something that Jews go to. Later on,
that they go to
and host. They host. We know
because it sounds like from the second one, it's an attendance issue.
It's an attendance issue.
But the first one is also hosting.
Right, and High second short seems to have functioned as the legal basis by which the famous rabbis that we use their poetry in services attended these kind of events when they themselves were of importance to the local non-Jewish government. I reckon that Jews basically had these parties and largely ignored what the stringent view of High. That certainly comes back in a later short of Maimonides, which hopefully we could examine at a future date. And
it's a good tease for a future episode.
And I also would like to point out a social observation that just as much as in Islamic society wine is prohibited, and in some Islamic traditions alcohol, so too in Jewish society it's impossible to prohibit music, really, and it's impossible to prohibit music and alcohol going together, and what that leads to in the kind of parties I described at the beginning.
And it goes back to what I said at the outset, which is, if this were a music show, right, this were a music first show, talking about music, why is there alcohol being involved?
Right.
Like, why not ban the alcohol? But that's not even on the table. Alcohol's a given.
Alcohol's a given.
It's the music that's up for discussion, right? And so that's
alcohol's a given.
Really
it's the music's up for discussion. I mean,
Yeah.
Also, I'd like to even add, Jews, of course, drinking non-Jewish wine implies that was also something they were doing. And there are shortim of Maimonides talking about touching.
Maimonides, yeah?
Yeah, I believe so. There are shortim of his talking about touching wine touched by Muslims. I know there's some, I think, of Rav Hai Gaon as well, or Rav Hai Gaon, I forget which, discussing this as well. So
that's true.
Right, so there's clearly a social issue, and that's represented here and in later texts about Jews, wine, parties, and the kind of poetry, music that they are subjected to in inverted commas. And I want to add an interesting point, and last to tie up at least the geographic location.
Yeah.
In Hacham Ezra Dangur, chief rabbi of Baghdad, between 1920 and 1925, I believe, a poisoned chalice of a job for all of his predecessors and successors. He writes in his commentary on Kohelet an observation that you may only go, Tov lelechet lebet mishteh, better to go to a house of mourning than to a drinking
house. But the reason is that you think about life.
You think about life,
right,
exactly. But he ties that verse to an observation. You should only attend musical parties and alcoholic parties which are religious.
I was going to say, it's one of the 3 appearances in Tanakh of the phrase Beit Mishteh.
Beit Mishteh, it is indeed.
Fun fact.
Absolutely.
Fun biblical fact.
Ties it in nicely. Yeah. I want to say
so
spanning 1,000 years, that roughly translates to the attitude that High sets. And yet the alternative pushback from the populace is always there. There's a Shach and a Taz which discuss reciting the Baracha for at a wedding. At a wedding where there's mixed seating. There is a short of Rav Hai Gaon talking about mixed seating in the same context, and the early Gaonic source doesn't seem bothered by it because parents are there, everyone will behave appropriately, alcohol's going to be present,
it's a given.
right? And in both, whereas the sort of the Shachtaz will shrug their shoulders and say, well, what can we do about it? So we'll be Mekel. In other words, basically, people at weddings ate and drank together, historically, but they may not always have danced together.
Okay.
Which, of course...
It's a whole other question.
Right, they may not... In other words, what rabbis want isn't necessarily what the people did historically.
Yes. Rabbi Isaac, thank you so much. This is really excellent. Is there anything you either want to promote or share for upcoming projects that you are working on?
Well, apart from wrapping up my dissertation, I am quite interested in something that came up in passing at the end of Rav Hai Gaon, which is he makes a metaphorical comparison to music and destruction by a metaphor that references white flour as fine and crumbly. A she'orah is a kind of insect which causes disease in trees and leads to it crumbling like fine flour is what he describes. What that is been researched, but I'm interested in rice and grains as eaten in the Middle East through this period and after.
So
consumables. Consumables. Yes. And one of the interesting things that comes up, of course, is alcohol. Although it's not of my own interest to my own research,
it's there, it's peripheral.
It's peripheral in the background. Importing and exporting of distant crops across vast distances by our prehistoric ancestors to this day includes, of course, wine and alcohol.
Of course.
Which I will leave for Elizabeth Lamphorn to talk more about. But
sounds great. All right, well, Rabbi Isaac.
Actually, I will. I want to add this in, so I'll say it.
Go for it.
Actually, one of the interesting things, at least if it's not wine, it's alcohol, is that in Tabaristan, in what is in modern-day Iran, along the Caspian shore, was the production of a rice wine. In the Middle Ages that would be imported as far as Iraq. I do not know much more about it than this, but maybe I will in a few years' time.
Hopefully you will. All right, Daniel, thank you so much. And with that, I want to say L'chaim.
L'chaim.
L'chaim.